The Last Broadcast. Part 1. The Strange Caller. Jake Martin was a radio DJ for a small-town station called Midnight Waves FM. His job was simple: play music, take requests, and chat with the night owls who tuned in. The show wasn't very popular, but Jake loved the quiet hours of the night. His studio was cozy, with its blinking lights, rows of CDs, and an old microphone that had seen better days. The station tower stood on a lonely hill outside town, where the silence of the night wrapped around him like a blanket. It was a normal Tuesday night. The clock read 11:47 p.m., and Jake leaned back in his chair, letting a soft rock song fill the airwaves. His voice had that smooth, comforting tone people like to hear at night. And that was Golden Horizon by the Echo Tones, he said, pressing a button to lower the music. This is Jake Martin, keeping you company through the long night. Call me at 555-7890 to share your thoughts, song requests, or just to say hi. The phone lines were usually quiet, with only a handful of regular callers. But tonight, something felt different. Jake couldn't quite put his finger on it. The air in the room felt heavier, like a storm brewing in the distance. He shook the thought away and sipped his coffee. At midnight, the phone rang. Jake smiled and picked up the receiver. Midnight Waves FM. This is Jake. Who's calling? There was silence on the other end. He could hear faint static, like an old radio struggling to find a signal. Hello? You're on the air, Jake said again. Finally, a low, shaky voice spoke. You need to listen carefully. Jake frowned. Sure. What's on your mind? There's a man walking down Maple Street, the voice said. It sounded distant, almost like a whisper. He's wearing a black coat. He has a knife in his pocket. Jake sat up straight. His first thought was that this was a prank call. Strange callers weren't unusual in his line of work, especially late at night. He decided to play along. All right, he said lightly. And what's this man planning to do? The voice paused for a long moment. Then it said, he's going to break into the bakery on the corner. He's going to hurt the owner. Jake laughed nervously. That's a pretty wild story. Should I call the cops? Yes, the caller said, their voice suddenly sharper. Call them now. You don't have much time. The line went dead. Jake stared at the receiver, unsure what to think. Was this some sort of prank? Or just a lonely person trying to get attention? He decided not to take it seriously. He went back on air, his voice calm as ever. Well, folks, that was an interesting call. If you're out near Maple Street, keep an eye on the bakery, I guess, he said with a chuckle. In the meantime, here's Midnight Blues by the Shades. As the song played, Jake tried to shake off the unease creeping into his thoughts. But it wasn't long before the phone rang again. Midnight Waves FM. This is Jake, he said, picking up the call. It was the same voice. I told you, the caller said, their tone icy. He's inside the bakery now. Do something. Jake felt his heart pound. Listen, if this is a joke, it's not funny. Who is this? The caller didn't answer. Instead, there was a muffled sound, like someone breathing heavily. Then the line went dead again. Jake sat frozen for a moment. He wasn't sure what to do. Maybe he should call the police, just in case. But what if it really was a prank? He didn't want to look foolish. After a few minutes of debating, curiosity got the better of him. He pulled up a map on his phone and searched for Maple Street. It was only a 10-minute drive from the station. "I'll check it out myself," he muttered, grabbing his jacket. Jake put the station on autopilot, letting the music play on its own. He locked the door behind him and stepped into the cold night air. The town was quiet, the streets empty except for a few flickering streetlights. As he drove toward Maple Street, the words of the caller replayed in his head. When he arrived at the bakery, everything seemed normal. The windows were dark, and the closed sign hung on the door. Jake felt a wave of relief. "Just a prank," he muttered, shaking his head. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something strange. The lock on the door was broken, hanging loose like it had been forced open. Jake's stomach twisted. He moved closer, peeking through the glass. Inside, the shelves were a mess, and there was a faint sound coming from the back of the shop. It was a muffled cry. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. This wasn't a prank. He dialed 911, his voice shaky but steady enough to explain what he had found. The operator assured him that help was on the way. As he waited, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. The street felt too quiet, the shadows too deep. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw a figure in a black coat disappearing into the night. Jake's breath caught. Whoever it was, they were gone now. But he knew this was only the beginning. When the police arrived, Jake gave his statement. The bakery owner, an elderly man, was shaken but unharmed. The officers thanked Jake for his quick thinking. But as he drove back to the station, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the caller. Who were they, and how did they know what was happening? Back at the station, Jake sat in front of the microphone, his heart still racing. He glanced at the phone, half expecting it to ring again. For the rest of the night, he waited, but no more calls came. Yet deep down, Jake knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the start of something far more terrifying. Part 2. The Voice Returns. The next night, Jake sat in the studio, staring at the phone. He couldn't get the strange caller out of his mind. Their voice, their words, the way they seemed to know exactly what was happening. It all made him uneasy. Jake had told himself to forget about it. But the broken lock at the bakery and the figure in the black coat wouldn't leave his thoughts. The night started as usual. Jake greeted his listeners, played a few songs, and even joked about how quiet the town was. "Maybe everyone's asleep early tonight," he said into the microphone. "Or maybe it's just one of those calm, boring nights." Let's hope it stays that way. But Jake didn't feel calm. Every time the phone didn't ring, he felt both relief and tension. Was the caller done, or would they return? At exactly midnight, the phone rang. Jake froze for a moment before reaching out to answer. His hand trembled as he picked up the receiver. Midnight Waves FM, he said, trying to sound normal. This is Jake. Who's calling? The same voice answered. You didn't believe me last night, the caller said softly. Jake's throat went dry. I called the police. They stopped it, didn't they? A pause. Then, you did the right thing. But it's not over. There's another one tonight. Jake felt his heart race. What do you mean? Another what? The caller's voice dropped, almost to a whisper. A woman is in danger. She lives alone in a small house on Oakwood Lane. Someone is watching her right now. He's waiting for her lights to go out. Jake felt a cold sweat on his forehead. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the desk. How do you know this? Who are you? The caller didn't answer. Instead, they said, she doesn't have much time. Do something. Before Jake could say another word, the line went dead. Jake sat back, his mind racing. Was this real? Was someone really in danger? Or was this caller playing with him? He thought about the bakery last night. The lock had been broken. The shelves were a mess. It had been real. Jake glanced at the clock. It was 12:05 a.m. If the caller was telling the truth, he didn't have time to waste. He grabbed his phone and searched for Oakwood Lane. It was on the other side of town, about a 15-minute drive. He hesitated. Should he call the police again? What if it was another prank? But what if it wasn't? Jake made up his mind. He dialed 911. This is Jake Martin, he told the operator. I got a call about a possible break-in or attack at a house on Oakwood Lane. I don't know if it's real, but you should check it out. The operator promised to send a patrol car. Jake hung up, his hands still shaking. He stared at the phone, half expecting the caller to ring back. But the phone stayed silent. Jake went back on air, his voice steady but his mind racing. All right, night owls, he said, forcing a smile. Here's Moonlit Drive by the Stargazers. Keep those requests coming. As the music played, Jake couldn't sit still. He paced the studio, checking his phone every few seconds. Around 12:30, the phone rang again. Jake grabbed it immediately. Hello, he said, his voice tight. It's done, the caller said. Jake's stomach dropped. What do you mean? What happened? The man ran away when the police arrived. The woman is safe. For now. Jake's mind raced. How do you know this? Are you watching all of this? Who are you? The caller's voice was calm, almost emotionless. I see things. Things other people can't. You need to listen to me, Jake. More lives are in danger. Jake felt a mix of fear and frustration. Why me? Why are you calling me? If you know so much, why don't you call the police yourself? They wouldn't believe me, the caller said simply. But you do. You saw what happened last night. You know I'm telling the truth. Jake wanted to argue, but he couldn't. The bakery, the broken lock, the woman on Oakwood Lane. It was all real. Before he could say more, the caller spoke again. Stay alert, Jake. I'll call when it's time. The line went dead. Jake sat there, his mind spinning. He didn't know what to do. He felt like he was being pulled into something far bigger than he could handle. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Jake went through the motions of his show, but his thoughts were elsewhere. When the morning DJ arrived to take over, Jake barely managed to say goodbye before leaving the station. As he drove home, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the caller. Who were they? How did they know so much? And why were they calling him? When he finally got home, Jake collapsed onto his couch, exhausted. But even as he closed his eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, the caller was watching, waiting. And Jake knew it was only a matter of time before the phone rang again. Part 3. Clues in the Static. Jake barely slept that morning. His dreams were filled with flashes of broken locks, dark streets, and that mysterious voice whispering in his ear. When he finally woke up, the sun was high, but the weight in his chest remained. He spent most of the day trying to distract himself. Reading, watching TV, even going for a walk. But no matter what he did, the caller's words echoed in his mind. More lives are in danger. By evening, Jake was back at the radio station, feeling restless and nervous. He kept telling himself he was overthinking. Maybe the caller wouldn't ring again. Maybe it was all over. But deep down he knew better. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Jake felt the tension in his body build. He went live, welcoming listeners to another night of Midnight Waves. His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he adjusted the microphone. "Good evening, night owls," he said, forcing a smile. "It's a quiet night out there, isn't it? Just you, me, and the music. Let's keep it that way." The first hour passed without incident. Jake played songs, read out requests, and answered a few casual calls. But his eyes kept drifting to the phone, waiting for it to ring. Finally, at exactly 12:01 a.m., it did. Jake's heart sank. He hesitated for a moment before picking up. "Midnight Waves," he said, his voice tighter than usual. The familiar voice came through the line. "Are you ready to listen, Jake?" Jake took a deep breath. "I don't have a choice, do I?" "Good," the caller said. "Tonight's going to be harder. Pay attention." Jake grabbed a notepad and pen, his fingers trembling. "Go on." "There's a man," the caller began. "He's parked in a blue car near Pinecrest Apartments. He's watching a young couple walking back from dinner. He's waiting for them to split up. Jake quickly jotted down the details. What's he planning to do? Follow the woman, the caller said. He's done this before. Twice. No one ever caught him. Jake felt his stomach turn. And how do you know this? I told you, the caller said calmly. I see things. But I can't stop them. You can. Jake clenched the pen in his hand. Why me? Why not just call the police yourself? The caller's voice was quiet, almost sad. They don't listen to me. They don't believe me. But you do, Jake. You're my voice. Jake didn't know what to say. He glanced at the clock, 12:06 a.m. He had to act fast. All right, Jake said. I'll call the police. Do it quickly, the caller replied. There isn't much time. The line went dead. Jake wasted no time. He dialed 911, giving the dispatcher all the details he'd just heard. The operator asked him how he knew, but Jake avoided the question. Just trust me, he said. Send someone there now. When he hung up, he stared at the phone, waiting. Minutes passed. Jake felt like he was holding his breath the entire time. Finally, the phone rang again. He picked it up immediately. Hello. The man's gone, the caller said. The police scared him off. But he'll try again. He always does. Jake felt both relief and frustration. Why can't they catch him? If you know so much, why don't you tell them who he is? The caller's voice was calm. I only see what's happening. Not who. Not why. That's why I need you, Jake. Jake slumped back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't how he'd imagined his life. Taking cryptic calls from a stranger and playing the middleman for crimes he couldn't understand. Is it over for tonight? Jake asked quietly. For now, the caller replied. But it's not the end. Stay ready. And just like that, the line went dead again. The next morning, Jake woke up to a series of messages on his phone. Friends, coworkers, even his boss had seen the news. Radio DJ helps prevent another crime. One headline read. Jake groaned. He didn't want the attention. He didn't even know if he deserved it. He wasn't a hero. He was just a guy in a studio, answering calls he didn't understand. At the station that evening, his boss stopped him before his shift. Jake, what's going on? She asked. 2 nights in a row, you've been calling the cops with these tips. People are starting to talk. Jake didn't know how to explain. I get these calls. Someone's giving me the information, and it turns out to be real. His boss frowned. And who's this someone? I don't know, Jake admitted. They won't tell me who they are. They just know things. His boss shook her head. Be careful, Jake. This is getting weird. And if something goes wrong, it's gonna come back on you. Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure what he could do. That night, Jake went live as usual, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were getting more complicated. He kept looking at the phone, waiting for it to ring. And when it finally did, right on schedule, Jake's heart sank. "Midnight Waves," he said, his voice quieter than usual. The caller didn't waste time. "There's a man in the park on Main Street. He has a knife. He's waiting for someone to pass by." Jake's hand tightened around the pen. "What park? Where exactly?" "Near the South Entrance," the caller said. "You have 10 minutes. Jake didn't hesitate. He called 911, giving them all the details. But this time he didn't just sit back and wait. Jake grabbed his keys and rushed out of the station. He had to see for himself. As he drove toward Main Street, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the caller. How did they know all of this? Were they really just an observer, or was there more to their story? When Jake arrived at the park, he saw flashing lights in the distance. A police officer waved him back, telling him it wasn't safe. Jake parked his car and watched from a distance. He saw officers surrounding a man near the south entrance. The man was shouting, holding a knife. Jake's stomach turned. The caller had been right again. As the man was taken into custody, Jake sat back in his car, trying to process everything. This wasn't just a series of random calls. This was a pattern. And Jake had the sinking feeling it was far from over. Part 4. Shadows in the Truth. Jake's car felt cold, even with the heater running. He sat there, staring at the flashing police lights in the park. The scene in front of him replayed over and over in his mind. The man with the knife, the police moving in, the way everything the caller had said turned out to be true. It wasn't just strange anymore. It was terrifying. By the time Jake got home, it was nearly dawn. He didn't bother trying to sleep. Instead, he sat in his small living room, sipping cold coffee and staring at the notepad where he'd scribbled the caller's clues. Who were they? And how did they know so much? As the sun rose, Jake made a decision. He couldn't keep doing this alone. He needed help. Later that day, Jake met his best friend, Sam, at a small diner near the station. Sam was one of the few people Jake trusted completely. They'd been friends since college, and Sam was the kind of guy who could keep a secret. Jake leaned across the table, lowering his voice. "I need to tell you something, but you have to promise not to freak out." Sam raised an eyebrow. "Okay, now I'm curious. What's going on?" Jake hesitated for a moment, then spilled everything. The late-night calls, the crimes, the police, everything. Sam listened quietly, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When Jake finally finished, Sam leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "That's intense," Sam said. "And you're sure the caller is real? This isn't some kind of prank?" "It's real," Jake said firmly. "Every time they call, they're right. They know things no one else could know." Sam nodded slowly. "All right. So, what do you want to do?" "I don't know. Jake admitted. But I can't handle this alone. I need someone to help me figure out who they are and what they want. Sam thought for a moment, then smiled. Well, lucky for you, I'm pretty good at solving mysteries. Let's start with the basics. Have you tried tracing the calls? Jake shook his head. The station system isn't that advanced. And the police haven't been much help. They don't take me seriously. Then we'll figure it out ourselves, Sam said. Next time they call, record everything. Their voice, any background noise, even the way they breathe. We'll analyze it and see what we can find. Jake felt a flicker of hope. You'd really help me with this? Of course, Sam said. What are friends for? That night, Jake returned to the station, feeling slightly more prepared. He'd brought a small recorder Sam had given him, and he kept it next to the phone, ready to capture the caller's every word. The first hour passed quietly. Jake played music, read messages from listeners, and tried to act normal. But his mind was racing. Then, at exactly 12:03 a.m., the phone rang. Jake took a deep breath and picked it up. Midnight Waves. The caller's voice was calm and familiar. Good evening, Jake. Jake hit the record button on the device. What do you have for me tonight? There's a house, the caller began. On Elm Street. The lights are off, but someone is inside. A man with a crowbar. He's waiting for the family to come home. Jake scribbled down the details, his heart pounding. Do you know the address? Number 42, the caller said. You have less than 20 minutes. Jake felt his pulse quicken. Anything else? The caller hesitated. This one feels different. What do you mean? Jake asked, gripping the pen tightly. But the caller didn't answer. The line went dead. Jake wasted no time. He called 911, giving them the address and the details. Then he called Sam. Elm Street, Jake said quickly. Number 42. Someone's breaking in. I'm on my way, Sam said without hesitation. Jake hesitated. Be careful, okay? You too? Sam replied, then hung up. When Jake arrived at Elm Street, the scene was already chaotic. Police cars lined the road, their lights flashing. Neighbors stood on their lawns, whispering to each other. Jake spotted Sam near one of the patrol cars and rushed over. What's going on? Jake asked. They got the guy, Sam said, pointing toward a man being led away in handcuffs. He was inside the house when the cops showed up. Jake felt a wave of relief. Did he hurt anyone? Sam shook his head. The family wasn't home yet, but they found tools in his bag, duct tape, rope, other stuff. It's a good thing you called when you did. Jake nodded, but his mind was racing. This was the third time the caller had been right. And this time, they'd saved a family from what could have been a nightmare. Back at the station, Jake and Sam sat in the recording booth, listening to the call. Listen closely, Sam said, pointing to the screen where the audio waveform flickered. There's something in the background. Jake leaned closer, straining to hear. At first, it was just static. But then he noticed it. A faint hum, like machinery or an engine running in the distance. What is that? Jake asked. Sam frowned. It could be anything. A generator, a fan, maybe even something outside their location. But it's consistent. Jake nodded. So, they're calling from somewhere with a lot of noise. Exactly, Sam said. It's a clue, but it's not much to go on. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's better than nothing. Sam leaned back, crossing his arms. The question is, why are they doing this? Why not call the cops themselves? Why involve you? Jake didn't have an answer. I don't know. But I'm starting to think they don't just want me to help. They want me to figure out who they are. Sam nodded slowly. Then we'll figure it out. Together. As the night wore on, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the caller was watching him, guiding him for a reason he didn't yet understand. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about stopping crimes. It was about uncovering a truth hidden in the static. Part 5. Echoes of the Past. Jake woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. The sunlight pouring through the curtains reminded him that he hadn't gotten much sleep. He reached for the phone, squinting at the screen. It was Sam. Hey, Jake mumbled. Get up, Sam said. I've been digging into the background noise we heard on the last call. I think I found something. Jake sat up quickly, the grogginess fading. What did you find? Meet me at the diner, Sam said. I'll explain everything. Jake got dressed in record time, grabbed his notes, and drove to the diner. When he arrived, Sam was already there, laptop open, a cup of coffee in hand. Sam pointed to the screen as Jake slid into the booth. That hum we heard? I ran it through some software to clean it up. It's not just random noise. It's a very specific sound. What is it? Jake asked, leaning closer. A radio tower, Sam said. The kind used for old AM stations. It's faint, but the pattern matches one located just outside of town. It's abandoned now, but the equipment might still be running. Jake frowned. You think the caller is using that tower? It's possible, Sam said. If they're broadcasting or making calls from nearby, it would explain the interference in the background. Jake's mind raced. We need to check it out. An hour later, Jake and Sam stood in front of the old radio tower. The structure loomed over them, rusted and surrounded by overgrown weeds. A chain-link fence encircled the area, but the gate was hanging open, as if no one had bothered to lock it in years. This place gives me the creeps, Sam muttered. Jake didn't respond. He was too focused on the faint hum he could hear now that they were closer. It was the same sound from the call. The two of them pushed through the gate and walked toward the small building at the base of the tower. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the scent of dust and mildew. Old equipment lined the walls, control panels, microphones, and tangled wires. Most of it was covered in a thick layer of grime, but a single desk in the corner looked different. Jake walked over and examined it. The surface was clean, and the chair had been recently moved. On the desk sat an old rotary phone, the kind that looked like it belonged in a museum. Next to it was a notebook. Jake picked up the notebook and flipped through the pages. His breath caught as he realized what it was. "It's a log," he said, "of all the calls they've made. Dates, times, everything." Sam peered over his shoulder. "They've been doing this for months." Jake turned to the most recent entry. It was from last night, detailing the break-in on Elm Street. The handwriting was neat and precise, as if the caller had taken great care with every word. "They're planning these calls," Jake said. "They're not just reacting to the crimes. They know about them ahead of time." Sam frowned. "How is that possible? Are they working with the criminals? Or are they stopping them?" Jake shook his head. "I don't know. But this changes everything." As they continued searching the building, Jake found more clues. A stack of old newspapers, all featuring stories about crimes that had been stopped thanks to anonymous tips. A map of the city with certain locations circled in red. But the strangest thing was the photo. It was taped to the wall near the desk, slightly yellowed with age. It showed a man sitting in front of a microphone, wearing headphones and smiling at the camera. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the man. "That's..." Jake started, but his voice faltered. Sam looked at him. "What? Who is it?" Jake swallowed hard. "That's Victor Hale. He used to host Midnight Waves. Before me." Sam's eyes widened. "The same Midnight Waves? Your show?" Jake nodded, staring at the photo. "He disappeared 10 years ago. Just vanished one night. No one ever found out what happened to him." Sam glanced around the room. "Are you saying he's the caller?" "I don't know," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. "But this place, this equipment, it all belongs to him. It has to." Before they could process what they'd found, Jake's phone rang. The sound made both of them jump, echoing in the silent room. Jake fumbled to answer it. "Hello." The familiar voice came through the line, calm and steady. "You're getting closer, Jake. But you're not ready for the truth." Jake's grip tightened on the phone. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" The caller paused. "Do you really want to know? Or are you afraid of what you'll find?" Jake's mind was spinning. "Tell me." The caller chuckled softly. "Soon. But first, there's something you need to see. Go to the old warehouse on Pine Street. Bring your friend. But be careful. There are others who don't want you to know the truth." The line went dead. Sam looked at Jake. What did they say? They want us to go to a warehouse, Jake said. On Pine Street, Sam's face darkened. Do you think it's a trap? Maybe, Jake admitted. But we don't have a choice. If this is our only chance to figure out what's going on, we have to take it. Sam nodded reluctantly. All right. But we need to be careful. As they drove to the warehouse, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far bigger than they'd realized. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was still unclear. One thing was certain. The caller knew more than they were letting on, and whatever secret they were hiding, it was worth risking everything to uncover. The question was, would Jake and Sam make it out alive? Part 6. The Final Showdown. Jake and Sam arrived at the old warehouse on Pine Street just as the sun began to set. The building looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and a rusty metal door hanging off its hinges. A feeling of unease hung in the air, but Jake pushed it aside. They had come too far to turn back now. Jake took a deep breath. This is it. Whatever happens, we need to be ready. Sam nodded, his face serious. We need to stick together. Don't go off on your own. They walked cautiously toward the entrance. As they approached, they heard a faint sound coming from inside, the unmistakable hum of a radio broadcast. Jake froze. The sound was identical to the one they had heard during the mysterious calls. They're here, Jake whispered. They stepped inside, and the door creaked loudly as it closed behind them. The warehouse was dark, and only the flickering light from a few old lamps illuminated the large, empty space. The air smelled damp, and the floor was covered in dust. Jake's heart raced as they moved forward, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. In the center of the room, there was a large table surrounded by several old radios and other equipment. At the far end of the room, a figure stood in front of a microphone, adjusting the dials. The hum grew louder. "Who's there?" Sam called out, his voice steady but tinged with fear. The figure turned slowly. It was a man, wearing a dark hoodie and sunglasses. His face was hidden in shadows. The man spoke in a low, calm voice. "I knew you'd come. You always come when you get too close." Jake's breath caught. "Victor?" he asked, barely believing it. The man nodded. "Yes, Jake. It's been a long time." Jake's mind was racing. "But you're gone. You disappeared 10 years ago. No one knew what happened to you." Victor chuckled softly. "I never disappeared, Jake. I was always here, watching, listening." Sam stepped forward. Why the calls? Why do you do this?" Victor smiled darkly. "You think I'm the one calling you, don't you? But you're wrong. I'm just the messenger." Jake's confusion grew. The messenger? Who's the one behind it all? Then, Victor's smile faded. "You're too late, Jake. The real power is already in motion. The people behind these crimes, they knew everything. They controlled it all. And now, they found a way to control you too. Sam looked at Jake, his eyes wide. What is he talking about? What does he mean by control? Victor walked slowly toward them, his voice growing quieter. You think the crimes were random? No, they were planned. But you didn't see the truth because you were too busy chasing after ghosts. Jake's head spun. What truth? What are you talking about? Victor pointed to the radios on the table. These radios, they don't just broadcast the news. They record it. They listen to everything. They hear every secret. The people who control the signal, they're the ones who make the calls. Jake was starting to understand. You're saying someone else is behind this? Someone even more powerful? Victor nodded slowly. Yes. And you're too late to stop them. The broadcast is just the beginning. Now the signal has spread, and they'll know everything you do. Sam clenched his fists. Who are they? Who's behind this? Victor didn't answer. Instead, he reached over and flipped a switch on the equipment. Suddenly, the room was filled with static, followed by a voice that was not Victor's. Jake, the voice said, clear and cold. You should have left well enough alone. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He recognized that voice. It was the same voice from the mysterious calls. What do you want from me? Jake shouted into the room. The voice laughed, sending a chill down Jake's spine. I want you to understand, Jake. You're just a small part of something much bigger. And now you're in our control. Jake's hands shook as he took a step back. What are you going to do? What happens now? Victor walked closer, his eyes glinting in the dim light. What happens now? Now we end the game. Before Jake could react, the door to the warehouse slammed open. More figures stepped inside, 3 men, all wearing masks, all carrying radios. One of them stepped forward, holding up a large control device. Victor raised his hand. It's too late. The signal is already out. There's nothing you can do now. But Jake didn't back down. I'm not giving up. I'll stop you. I'll stop all of you. Sam grabbed Jake's arm. We need to move. Now. The men with the radio stepped forward, but before they could react, Jake and Sam ran toward the back of the warehouse. They dashed behind a stack of crates, breathing heavily. We have to do something, Sam whispered. Jake's mind raced. He looked around, his eyes falling on the control panel near the equipment. There had to be something they could use to stop the broadcast. Without thinking, Jake made a decision. I'm going to destroy the equipment. It's the only way. Sam shook his head. You can't. It's too dangerous. But Jake was already moving, making his way toward the control panel. As he reached out to disconnect the wires, the figure with the mask turned and spotted him. Stop! The man yelled. Jake didn't hesitate. He yanked the wires out, and the room fell silent. The hum from the radios stopped instantly, leaving only the sound of their heavy breathing. Victor's voice came through the speakers one last time. "You may have stopped the broadcast, Jake, but the signal will never die." Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the sound of footsteps approached. Jake braced himself, ready for whatever came next. He could feel the presence of the masked men drawing closer. But then, nothing. The footsteps stopped. The air grew still. Jake and Sam stood in the dark, unsure of what had just happened. Were the men still there? Had they won? After a few long seconds, the lights came back on, and the warehouse was empty. The men were gone. Jake and Sam exchanged a look of disbelief. "Did we do it?" Sam asked. Jake nodded slowly, still trying to process everything. "I think so, but I don't know for sure." As they walked toward the exit, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. The signal may have stopped for now, but there was always another broadcast waiting to be heard. And who was really behind it all? That question would haunt him for a long time. The end of one broadcast was only the beginning of another. And Jake knew, deep down, that the last broadcast wasn't really the end. It was only the beginning of a new, darker chapter. That's the end of the story. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more exciting tales. Check out our other videos and share your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for the next adventure. Thanks for watching.